again here with Gita from Zero, and we are doing session 33, which is part 9 of chapter 2. And today we're going to be working from verses 54 to 58. So that's about 4 verses. 4 or 5 verses, whatever it is. My brain's not working properly this morning, today. Okay, so this section opens a new section of this Bhagavad Gita. So we're here at 712. This is chapter 2, section part 9. So we're going to discuss the flow of chapter 2, Arjuna's 4 questions, and here are his 4 questions. However, one of those questions is not in today's class. The 4th question will be in next week's class. So question 1 is, he's asking, what are the symptoms of a Sthita-Dhīr, a Sthita-Prajñasya, a very advanced devotee? And then he asks, how does he speak? In other words, how does he respond? How does he sit? Non-engaging. And then we're going to talk about Sthita-Dhīr munis, happiness and distress, and a higher taste. Next week, we will do the 2nd section of this subsection 5. So subsection 5 is the last subsection of chapter 2. And it'll more or less be 3 parts, so there'll be I don't have it down yet, but on the 26th then, we'll have number 11, which will be the last section of the last subsection of this chapter of chapter 2. And then I'll do some review of chapter 2, and then we'll move on to chapter 3. That's kind of how I plan to work here. Now, today we're just going to go over, actually we're going to go to 59. That was 5 verses really. So this is subsection 5, which I'm calling transcendentalists. Krishna talks about the nature of transcendentalists because Arjuna asks a question, so Krishna responds to the question, and he explains about the kind of person that Krishna wants Arjuna to be. So today we're going to talk about his 4 questions. Question 1, the symptoms. Question 2, how does he respond? Question 3, how does he not respond? Or how does he sit? Then we have about Sthita-Dhīr munis, happiness, distress, higher taste. Okay, so we have been talking about chapter 2, and as you see, we are at the end of chapter 2. It's a very big chapter, so most of the chapters are not nearly as intricate, not nearly as many parts, not nearly as many verses. Most of them have about half the verses that chapter 2 does, except when you come to chapter 18, when that one has, I think, 76 verses. This one has 72. So Krishna speaks on transcendentalists, and he's speaking on transcendentalists because Arjuna asks 4 questions, and that's what's happening. If you'll recall how chapter 2 went was, in chapter 1, Arjuna had listed a whole bunch of doubts, a whole bunch of problems that he saw if he continues and goes through with fighting this battle of Kurukshetra. He had those issues. And then Krishna, in the beginning of chapter 2, says, how have these impurities come upon you? Then Arjuna loads down some more doubts. And then he says, but I'm going to surrender to you, Krishna, and you instruct me, but I won't fight. And then Krishna begins his instruction. He did that In subsection 2, which was the not the body subsection, we heard all about the nature of the body and the soul and how those two are different. That was practically 20 verses, 21 verses. Then here, on subsection 3, Krishna had some further arguments that describe Arjuna's position in society. So he was doing that. That was just about 7 or 8 verses in that subsection 3. Then we spent 3 weeks talking about Buddhi Yoga, which is Buddhi Yoga, as we were learning, is just another name for Bhakti Yoga. So in other words, it's the yoga of people who are intelligent. And we finished that. And so now we're beginning this last section where Krishna will speak on transcendentalists. We're going to hear some of these themes again. This is a summary. So these same questions and these same discussions, to some extent, will come up again in chapters 3, 4, and 5, and even in 6. Krishna will go back to some of the same themes and points that he's making, but he'll elaborate on them a little bit more. And so Arjuna doesn't pick it all up on the first go around. So if Arjuna had been able to pick it up, Krishna could have stopped with chapter 2, but he doesn't stop with chapter 2. He goes on all the way through to chapter 18. Now, Arjuna is hearing all these things about the kind of person that is actually the right kind of person. And he will ask Krishna, what can I know about such a person? What would this person be like? How would I know if I saw this kind of person? How would I know if I'm becoming this kind of person? So that's his 4 questions. And we'll start here. We see here in the very first verse here, 54, Arjuna said, "O Krishna, what are the symptoms of one whose consciousness is thus merged in transcendence? How does he speak? What is his language? How does he sit? And how does he walk?" So these are Arjuna's 4 questions. Symptoms, speak, sit, walk. Those 4 things. Symptoms, speak, sit, walk. Now, Arjuna is using metaphoric language. So what does he exactly mean by symptoms? It means, how can you know someone who is a transcendental person? What are his qualities, his qualifications? So that's what symptoms means. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then, how does he speak? In other words, how does he respond when something happens to him, or when somebody is talking to him or trying to convince him of something? How does a transcendentalist person respond? And then, how does he sit? What is that supposed to mean? Doesn't mean does he sit in a lotus position or a half lotus or something like that. It means in what circumstances does he refrain from action? Because when you're sitting, you're not acting, you're refraining from action. So that's really the question there. And how does he walk? And that question is translated, to how does he act in the world? When does he do something, and under what circumstances does he do it? So these are 4 questions that Arjuna is asking. What are the symptoms? How does he speak in his language? So how does he communicate? How does he respond? How does he sit? How does he refrain from action? And how does he walk? And so Krishna does a kind of one-word response. This is often the way Krishna does this in Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna will ask a question, and Krishna will give kind of a one-verse answer. But he may elaborate more later on in the succeeding verses. So the first verse, 55, is how Krishna answers Arjuna's first question. What are his symptoms? So here is how Krishna answers in one verse what the symptoms are of this. We're going to use a technical term here, Sthita-Prajñasya or Sthita-Dhīr Muni. So Sthita means steady or fixed. Dhīr is not moved by the senses, very, self-contained. So Sthita-Dhīr Muni or a Sthita-Dhīr yogi. And so this is what Krishna has been trying to point Arjuna at this whole time. He's told him about Buddha yoga, that one should do this, one should be like this, etc., etc. And the end result of someone who follows these directions will become a Sthita-Dhīr Muni, someone who is fixed in transcendence. So what are his symptoms? The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, O Partha, when a man gives up all varieties of sense gratification, which arise from mental concoction, and when his mind thus purified finds satisfaction in the self alone, then he is said to be in pure transcendental consciousness. So what are the key points here? He gives up varieties of sense gratification, and his mind finds satisfaction in the self. So instead of using the mind and the body to track down and engage with sense gratification, instead of doing that, one finds satisfaction in the self. Now, that sounds like a mysterious statement. And in fact, it is somewhat of a mysterious statement. What that means is that one finds satisfaction from within. Because if a person becomes a devotee of Lord Krishna, one is satisfied automatically within himself because he's serving Krishna. He feels satisfied. He does not depend on the, stock market exchange of sense gratification for that particular day or moment. We all know that sometimes things look like they're going our way and sometimes they don't. Sometimes we look in the refrigerator and there's all kinds of nice things to eat, and sometimes we just see some rotten fruit and some things that we really hadn't wanted to eat for a long time. We probably better throw them away. So so that's the way it works, that sometimes everything is there for us in the way we hope it would be for our gratification. And on other occasions, it's not there. So for a person who lives for sense gratification, this is like riding the wave. When you find things that make your senses very pleased, you feel very happy. When you don't find things that please your senses, you feel bored. And when you find things that are the opposite of what you would rather experience, you feel pain or anxiety, or you feel uncomfortable. So the Sthita-Dhīr Muni, this person who is fixed in transcendence, a transcendental person, he does not give much interest or focus on sense gratifications, plans for it, but rather his mind becomes satisfied, he becomes purified, he becomes peaceful. And then that is called pure transcendental consciousness. And this is the symptom. So Arjuna wants to know, what is the symptom of a Sthita-Dhīr Muni? Krishna explains it right there. Now, he's asking, how does he speak? In other words, how does he respond to people? And here is Krishna's, he's going to use two verses for this, 56 and 57. one who is not disturbed in mind, even amidst the threefold miseries, or related when there is happiness, and who is free from attachment, fear, and anger, is called a sage of steady mind. So most people, they immediately react. So if there are threefold miseries, we react by trying to get out of the situation, or we react by having some, we try to do something. We try to immediately adjust the situation. So, and on the other side of the coin, when there is apparently happiness, then we jump for joy. And so when a person is even, he's not disturbed in the threefold miseries, and he is not also elated when there is happiness, and he's free from attachment, fear, and anger, he's called a sage of steady mind. So in one sense, this kind of covers the same territory that the previous verse did. Those were the symptoms. Now this is how he interacts with those around him and with the environment. So if the environment is miserable, he's not particularly disturbed. And if the environment is, at the present moment, it's very favorable for his sense gratification, he's not overly elated by that. So the threefold miseries, by the way, are miseries according to the other living entities, adibhotic. Adidaivic miseries are miseries according to the demigods, and adhyatmic miseries according to ourselves. So these are called the threefold miseries. In other words, when we suffer, we get bad stuff that comes down these three different chutes. One of them is from ourselves. We cause misery for ourselves. We worry too much, or we slam our, Hare Krishna. You can come in if you want. We slam our hand in the door. We worry too much, or we feel attracted to smoking, so we're causing future miseries for ourselves, or even present miseries for ourselves. Then there's miseries by others, which is the most easy to relate to kind of misery. So somebody insults us, somebody hits us, somebody takes something away from us, and so we find that kind of misery. And then there's adidaivic miseries, which are miseries from the demigods. Floods, hurricanes, droughts, diseases, all these kind of things are miseries that are visited upon us from the demigods. So these are called the threefold miseries. And these happen to everybody. And these threefold miseries are not, there's some gray area, and, there's some kinds of, overlap between them. So at any rate, it's a rare person who is not deeply disturbed by these miseries. And so when there's happiness, then usually people are overjoyed. But if you're focusing on the material miseries or the material happiness, then you are not a Sthita-Dhīr Muni. You will become gradually entangled. So we become free from attachment, fear, and anger, and then we become a sage of steady mind. So how do we become free from attachment and aversion? How do we become free from being too preoccupied with getting rid of the miseries, or too preoccupied with trying to experience elation with various happy situations? And the answer to that is through regulation. We regulate the senses. We don't indulge them too much, nor do we cut them off. So a person who regulates their connection, this will come out not in this chapter of Bhagavad Gita, but later on in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains that able to deal with the senses and their pushings by regulating them. All right. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So here is more about how does he speak. In the material world, one who is unaffected by whatever good or evil he may obtain, neither praising it nor despising it, is firmly fixed in perfect knowledge. Now, the word they use there is good or evil, but probably a better word is auspicious or inauspicious. And that's where the Sanskrit reads, that Shubha, Shubha. So Shubha is auspicious and Ashubha is inauspicious. So when things are going our way, we're not overly disturbed. When we're not overly affected in a positive way. When things are not going our way, we're not overly disturbed. So again, this is kind of Sthita-Dhīr means that not focused on the senses, focused within. If you're focused within, happiness is coming to you from the spiritual plane, and you're not so dependent on happiness coming from outside. So again, that's how does he speak. Now we're going to learn about how does he sit. And in this case, Krishna uses an analogy. He says, one who is able to withdraw the senses from the sense object, as a tortoise draws its limbs within the shell, is firmly fixed in perfect consciousness. So how does a Sthita-Dhīr Muni react when there is something unfavorable for spiritual life? Now, there may be some things that technically we like, the body actually likes, but they're unfavorable for spiritual life. So the tortoise withdraws his limbs within the shell. Whenever a turtle is faced with some danger, the tortoise just sucks his arms, head, and legs into his shell, and then he just looks like a rock, And so, because his shell is so thick, that most animals can't do anything with that. So he's safe from predators that way. So in a similar way, the devotee, when he senses that there is some temptation or some kind of unwanted situation, he withdraws. He doesn't feel necessity to engage. And this is how the Sthita Muni sits. And then the last verse that we're going to read today, for the body soul may be restricted from sense enjoyment, though the taste for sense objects remains. But ceasing such engagements by experiencing a higher taste, he is fixed in consciousness. So that's the key there, higher taste. If spiritual life was all about negating our material pleasures, then how would anybody be able to live with that for their whole lives, If all we were doing was trying to get ourselves to do things we really don't want to do and prying ourselves away from things that we really like, then that would be a hellish kind of existence. And oftentimes materialists have that understanding. They will say, what do you do for fun? How do you live with all these restrictions? Don't you sometimes just want to go out and blow it out, But there's an interesting thing which most people have no knowledge of, and that's this higher taste, which means that at a certain mature stage of devotional service, our material wants and unwants, things that we like and things that we dislike, they flip around. Like famous saying goes that everything I like is either illegal, immoral, or fattening, So people say that. But there comes a time in the process of devotional service where our sensibilities flip around, where we actually like spiritual activities, and we're actually not attracted to things at one time were our whole focus in life. At one time we thought this was what we really want to do, but now we're not so eager to do that anymore. It's faded in our consciousness. Now, admittedly, this doesn't happen right at the beginning. And so in the beginning, yes, it's a struggle with the senses. The senses want this, we say no. Senses want that, we say no. But with things that are not very illicit, we restrict them. We take so much, but not too much and not too little. Take too little, we tend to go in a Bhoga Tyaga cycle. We take too much, we tend to get drawn into material life again. So that's the struggle that we'll always have. But there will come a time in mature devotional service where you believe, you actually come to experience that you're not as insanely attracted to the things that you were attracted to some years ago. You're no longer finding that, and, still the senses are pulled by some unwanted, illegal, illicit, and immoral things. Still the senses find themselves pulled, but it's not so strong anymore. And some things you just lose the taste for altogether, in material life. And, I have this experience of walking down a street in New York City, and I see all these stores, and I think, why would anybody want to go in there? But, obviously those stores are making money. People are going in there. Tobacco shops, people are going in there. People are buying those, big rage now with those electronic smokes that everybody goes, and gets, the latest this, the latest that, various fashions, various, we all have to wear something, but, you begin to find that things that were once your whole purpose in life are no longer as have as much gravity or pull on you. And this shows that our sensibilities are changing. We actually begin to want to eat better food. We begin to actually want to treat our own bodies better. We're no longer attracted to the idea of going to some dingy dive and, smoking up a bunch of stuff or drinking some stuff and, hoping that we don't throw up before we go home, all those kind of things. So this is the higher taste. It's a very important thing. Somewhere down the line, this will happen. It happens gradually. It happened for me, I was insanely attracted to so many things. Now I'm not insanely attracted to them, maybe still attracted, but not insanely attracted to it the way I once was. So this process actually delivers. Any questions?
The word gradually, like Srila Prabhupada mentioned many times, is gradually when you want to be on the top of the mountain, but it just takes you step by step, and sometimes it's very slow, but it's just gradually you're taking there.
Yeah. So that's the way spiritual life works. You can think, if I'm experiencing some percentage of relief from the attraction that I once had, then it's not such a stretch to believe that in the future I'll experience less attraction and attachment. And that's certainly something I've experienced, that as the years cross on, my attraction for so many different things has lessened. I would never spend my time doing some kinds of things that I once couldn't live without. is into water bottle 2 here. Okay, so here are some of Prabhupada's points. If we read the purports to those verses, here we have the 4 questions again. Sit, speak in language, sit. Oh, I doubled sit. It should be symptoms. Speak in language, sit and walk. And then symptoms of things, Prabhupada says, everything is known by its symptoms. A rich man is known by having wealth, Somebody says, I'm a rich man, but they don't have any money. They're not really a rich man. So we know, a person by their symptoms. And Prabhupada uses another analogy that a fool is known by his speech. That someone may be a well-dressed and very, wealthy fool. And as long as he presents himself nicely and doesn't say anything, most people wouldn't know. But the minute you open your mouth and you say something ridiculous, then everybody knows, oh, this person's a fool, And there are a lot of people like that, people who apparently seem to be very erudite, but they say very foolish things, or people who apparently seem to be very famous in our world, and they say foolish things, or people who are very wealthy and they say foolish things. So we know that you can be a wealthy fool, you can be a knowledgeable fool, you can be a famous fool. So, but being a fool is known by one's speech. Okay, so Prabhupada, in his purports, he indirectly talks about this verse 5:18-12. We'll look at that verse in a minute. And that by engaging in devotional service, one will gradually accrue all the qualities of the demigod. Yasyasti bhaktir bhagavati kinchana sarvayarganas tatra samasate sara haras bhaktasya kuto mahadgana mano ratena sati dhavato mahi. So all the qualities of the demigods, including knowledge, religion, etc., become manifest in someone who is a servant of Mukunda, the giver of liberation. On the other side of them, someone who is not a devotee of the Lord, even if they're adept at the process of mystic yoga or the honest endeavor of maintaining their family and relatives, must be following the chariot of the mind. And how can there be any good qualities in such a person? So Prabhupada indirectly quotes that verse. He doesn't mention the number or where it came from, but he sort of indirectly quotes it. So sense control cannot be artificial. If you try to artificially control your senses, you will certainly fail. So Krishna consciousness is not about ripping ourselves away from the senses or sitting in some cave somewhere, biting our fingernails, wishing we could do some things that we can't do. By doing positive, the negative goes away. By using the senses, but in the process of Krishna consciousness, in doing devotional activities, one automatically gets real sense control. Any questions about that? Okay, so Mahabharata. Prabhupada quotes this verse in the purports. This is, a very key verse in the Vana Parva, where it says that a Muni, unless what he says contradicts what another Muni says, then he's not accepted as a Muni. So this is the nature of philosophers, mundane philosophers, that one cannot take seriously what mundane philosophers say, because the only way that a philosopher can claim any kind of following is by contradicting someone else. And we see through history of the Western world, every philosopher made his place in the whole queue or the list of philosophers by negating something some previous philosopher said, or adding to it in some kind of way. So this is, what the Mahabharata says. Actually, the Mahabharata, in that particular verse, 313.117, that in that verse, it's saying that Tarko Pratishta Shruyato Vibhina Nasa Rishiryasya Matam Nabinam Dharmasya Tattvam Nihitam Guhayam Mahajano Yenigata Sapanta. So Tarko Pratishta means dry arguments never give us any final conclusion. Shruyato Vibhinam, if you try to research the scriptures on your own, you'll see that they apparently contradict one another and that they apparently say different things. And then a Muni who doesn't disagree with other Munis, who won't be considered a great person. So those are three ways you can't know the absolute truth. So how do you know the absolute truth? And that is Dharmasya Tattvam Nihitam Guhayam Mahajano Yenigata Sapanta. The solid truth of spiritual life is known by, it's hidden in the heart of a pure devotee. Therefore, as the scriptures enjoin, one should seek out those elevated devotees and follow whatever paths, progressive paths, they might enunciate or discuss. So that's what that verse is about. But it's put there in the context of the Sthita-Dhīr Muni, because a regular Muni is always known by contradicting other Munis, but a Sthita-Dhīr Muni is not that kind of Muni. So that's 7, a regular Muni and a Sthita-Dhīr Muni. So again, we've talked a little bit about freedom from attachment and aversion, freedom from good and evil. And Prabhupada uses the snake charmer analogy. Have any of you ever seen a snake charmer? What's that? Well, in
the person who is just playing the flute or something, like musical instrument, and snakes,
a flute or a shanai or something like that, and we have this picture, usually in American movies and Western movies. There's one of those stereotypic things where you have a person sitting down and there's a snake, a cobra coming out of a pot, and he's like, and the snake is enchanted by the sound and won't bite, So this is this analogy means that if one is engaged in devotional services, the senses are like snakes. They're ready to bite something, they want to get something. And so if we engage in devotional service, we won't get bitten, and our senses won't drag us into something. So that's the snake charmer analogy. And we have also another animal here. It's the tortoise analogy. We talked about that a minute ago, that the tortoise, whenever it senses danger, withdraws, senses into its shell. Okay, we talked about higher texts. Any questions on that? These are some salient points that Prabhupada makes in the purports to those verses from 54 to 59, so that's what's there. That's why I put it together as one package there, Prabhupada's point. And Burijan, in his book, Surrender Unto Me, he makes these following points, So again, Sthita-Dhīr Muni and Sthita-Prajñasya, fixed in knowledge. So the point that Krishna is trying to get to place in Arjuna's thinking is this fixed in knowledge. A person who's fixed in knowledge is a person who is a fixed person. So if you're fixed in knowledge, what does it mean to be fixed in knowledge? It means to have these qualifications, to use the senses for serving the Supreme Lord. And then you'll begin to have these qualifications or symptoms. So it's Burijan that mentions that where we translate this concept of symptoms. What does it mean? So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita, he explains what symptoms relates to. It's a metaphoric term, so symptoms means what are the characteristics. And of course, we saw that was answered in Bhagavad Gita 2.55. How does he speak in his language? How are his intelligence and words affected by another's affections, anger, or neutrality? In other words, how does he respond? So this is how Burijan, by quoting Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, this is how he gives us an understanding of what speak in his language, what that metaphoric question that Arjuna has asked Krishna, what it actually means to us in our modern way of thinking. So how does he respond? And that was, as we discussed, answered in 256 to 257. And then how does he sit? How does he not engage his senses? And that's in 58 and 59. And then how does he walk? We won't get there today, but that's in 64 to 72. And that's the explanation of how he does engage his senses. Any questions about that? So that's a little bit more of a deep. Now this is the verse. Is that readable? It's probably borderline. It's kind of small. So this is the verse that I just quoted, 5:18-12. Yes, yati bhaktir bhagavati kinchana sarvaya gunas tatra samasate sura harava bhaktasya kuto mahadgunan mano urtena sati dhavato vahi. All the demigods and their exalted qualities, such as religion, knowledge, and renunciation, become manifest in the body of one who has developed unalloyed devotion for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva. On the other hand, a person devoid of devotional service and engaged in material activities has no good qualities. Even if he is adept at the practice of mystic yoga or the honest endeavor of maintaining his family and relatives, he must be driven by his own mental speculations and must engage in the service of the Lord's external energy. How can there be any good qualities in such a man? So here are the demigods, and one can get all good qualities by just engaging in devotional service. And devotional service is the safe path, because we are not just biting down and trying to sit on the senses, trying to keep them from doing anything. That's always a dangerous path. But instead, we're using the senses, but we're using them to serve the Supreme Lord, which is different than just trying to shut them off or try to wrap bandages over them so they don't do anything. And the point it's making there is that if a person has what appear to be good qualities, but they're not actually focused on the Supreme Lord, those qualities are not really going to root very deeply, and they can be pulled out at any time, just like a castle built on the beach. The water comes in and washes it away. The only way one can have permanent good qualities is by being rooted in their connection to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So then we can have permanent good qualities. But otherwise, all good qualities are ultimately rooted down to sense gratification. And for one reason or another, we may have a good quality that's actually, if we follow the chain of cause and effect, we come to the fact that that quality is actually a type of sense gratification. So as a person continues in life, if some other sense gratification becomes more important than the particular sense gratification that material good quality is rooted in, then that good quality disappears. So if someone is actually, as it says here, has devotion for the Supreme Person, then someone can have permanent good qualities. All right, so that Prabhupada doesn't directly quote that verse, but this is the verse that he's discussing in one of his purports. Any questions about that aspect? Okay. So here are the we're going to just go over these quickly. What are his symptoms? Gives up the desire for sense gratification. Mind finds satisfaction in the self alone. Has all good qualities, no mental concoctions. Engages fully in Krishna consciousness. Realizes he's eternal servitor of the Supreme. Engages in devotional service. And no petty materialism. So these are the symptoms of this Sthita-Dhīr Muni, which I pulled from what Krishna actually says in the verses and what Prabhupada discusses in the purports. These are the qualities of a Sthita-Dhīr Muni, or the symptoms. And how does he speak and what's his language? He's not disturbed by the threefold miseries. He's not elated by happiness. He's free from attachment, fear, and anger, unaffected by good and evil. He doesn't chase various speculations, and he's not angry when he fails. These are how the Sthita-Dhīr Muni responds to the world and to others by having these qualifications. So these are the qualifications of how he responds or reacts. And how does he sit? He withdraws his senses into the shell like a tortoise. And he uses his senses only when required. In this way, by using the senses, Krishna doesn't talk about it, nor does Prabhupada in the purports. Later on in Bhagavad Gita, we learn that the best way to deal with the senses is to use the process known as regulation. We are regulated in our habits of eating and sleeping, and in that way we become gradually more and more aloof from the pull of the senses. We don't do things too much, we don't do things too little. We find that middle ground in between. And of course, there's some things we absolutely forego, like illicit sex, gambling, meat eating, and intoxication. Those things we try to give up completely. But other things we find a happy middle ground on. And of course, we act only according to scriptures, and we use our senses for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord. So within the process of bhakti yoga, one can use music, one can use art, one can use one's knowledge, one can use, do anything, cooking, cleaning, one can do any kind of activity, but that activity is directed to please the Supreme Lord. Any questions there? So we won't do question 4 because, we'll look at it pretty quickly, but that one's really next week. We'll find out more about it because it's a later thing. One's free from attachment and aversion, controls senses using the regulative principles of freedom. So here, that concept is touched on, that by regulating the senses, we become free. And in such a way, one achieves the complete mercy of the Supreme. And this way, we are not trying to control the senses artificially. We control the senses through service. So that's how does he walk? In other words, when he does use his senses, this is how he uses them. And when he sees there's a situation where he doesn't want to use his senses, he follows the turtle plan, So when he doesn't want to use his senses, he withdraws like the tortoise within the shell. When he does want to use them, he uses them in this way. Okay. So these are the qualifications of a Sthita-Dhīr Muni: not disturbed mind amidst the threefold miseries, not elated when there's happiness, free from attachment, fear, anger, unaffected by whatever good or evil he may obtain, never praising or despising it, firmly fixed in perfect knowledge. So these are the qualifications. In other words, these are the earmarks that make a person a Sthita-Dhīr Muni. And this is what Krishna is asking Arjuna to act in accordance with, to become a Sthita-Dhīr Muni. And of course, how do we do that? And the rest of the Bhagavad Gita helps us to understand how to do that. But in essence, it means regulation and following the 9 processes of devotional service. So if we're always following 9 processes of devotional service, where is the possibility to become swept up in the senses again? It won't happen. And finally, my last slide for the day. Krishna mentions this concept of higher taste. And this is also mentioned we hear that there are 9 stages of devotional achievement. And so a person who puts their feet on the path of devotional life then gradually walks up this ladder. In this case, we're walking down the ladder. I couldn't figure out how to get the numbers to go the opposite way. So we had to do it upside down. But
okay. From first to second. So that's
right. So Shraddha should be 9, but then, and it's the highest, but in this case, we have to do it upside down. So Shraddha is how we start. That means that someone has a preliminary faith that there is something to spiritual life. And when someone has a faith that there is a reality to spiritual life, they associate with like-minded people, which is sadhu sangha. They associate. And through their connection with these like-minded people, they begin to follow certain processes. We were just talking about them, the various regulations. They regulate the senses, they do service for Krishna, they chant, various processes of bhakti yoga. And this is the stage called bhajana kriya, or initiation, and acting under the auspices or the direction of a spiritual guide. Then anartha nivriti. If we do that for some time, there'll be cleansing. The consciousness will become reduced from all the gross, unwanted things we've collected in our mind and heart for many lifetimes. These things will gradually be cleansed out, and that's called anartha nivriti. Finally, there's nishtha. At that point, we will be steady. Now, notice here the word steadiness. So Krishna was talking about a Sthita-Dhīr Muni. So this is the steadiness of the Sthita-Dhīr Muni. And when we get to that stage, the next step is ruchi, or taste. This is what we were talking about, the higher taste. At that stage of devotional service, then a person is no longer really interested in the material world. At that point, spiritual life starts to go much faster. The whole process of spiritual life is kind of like one of those big installment loans, where the very beginning, when you get like say you buy a house, in the very beginning, you put down a little bit of money and you paid off maybe 1/100th or 1/30th of the cost of the house. And when you make your subsequent payments each month, most of the payment goes against the principal. Goes against the debt service, and only a small bit goes against the principal. But as you get further and further along, as you pay off more and more of the house, you pay off 50% of it, you pay off 75% of it. When you're at that stage, then almost all the money you're paying, your monthly installment each month, is paying off far more of the principal than it did at the beginning. So it's kind of slow to get started, but toward the end of it, you're really kind of making big, rocking forward on a very high and quick way, So ruchi is taste. At that point, we lose our taste for material life, and we're no longer actually contemplating what it would be like to enjoy those sensory things that once were the whole point of our lives. We're no longer thinking like that. Instead, we're looking forward to engaging in devotional service, and we're getting newer and newer realizations, and we're experiencing the happiness from doing devotional service. So that's ruchi, or taste. beyond Ruchi, there's something called Atta Shakti, which is we begin to have an inkling of what service we originally were doing in the spiritual world. We begin to have a glimpse of that. And so we are spontaneously attracted. Then above that is bhava, where we're beginning to get into the precincts of high love of God, which culminates in prema, which is the highest love of God. So these are the various stages of devotional service. We're all at one of those stages somewhere. And as we, continue with devotional service, we will move higher and higher on these stages until we finally get to prema. And when we get to 6, that's where we begin to experience the higher tastes. Any questions about that? Okay. So that's it for today. We'll again next week. On the 19th, we'll do 60 to 66, and we'll hear a little bit about Ashtanga Yoga, and we'll go a little further into how does he walk or how does he engage, which is where question 4 is. It's in that group from 60 to 66. And then we'll talk a little bit about controlling the mind, sense control, and how a person becomes a slave to the material world and falls down through contemplating the objects of the senses. So 7 steps to fall down. So that's what'll take place next week. Any final questions or comments? All right. So thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.